Hey guys, Walls here with a reading of Excerpt from the Harvest Gypsies. This is an article by John Steinbeck featured on CommonLit. I'm reading this as the PDF here, so I do not have the guided reading questions that you guys have. So as you get to those, you can pause the reading and answer those questions. So this was written by John Steinbeck. He is the author of Mice and Men, which is going to be our novel study. And I like to start off our novel study with this article because A, it's written by John Steinbeck, but he also writes about migrant workers. And the main characters of the novel we're going to read, of Mice and Men, are migrant workers. So this was written in 1936. We know that is in the height of the Great Depression. So there's a lot going on within society in general, but Steinbeck here focuses on the plight of California's agricultural industry and the role of migrant workers in it. One thing I like to point out about Steinbeck is he's not just an author who looked at these people from the outside. He spent time living as a migrant worker himself. He traveled extensively. He wasn't just he didn't just look at this stuff like it's under a microscope. He lived these experiences and he knew these people very well. So as I read this, I want you to pay attention to the language that Steinbeck uses to describe the common life and work experiences of migrant farm workers. So this is nonfiction, but Steinbeck has a way of writing that is formal, but also in a little bit conversational, almost poetic at times. So pay attention to the language Steinbeck uses, see why you like it or don't like it. And here we go. At this season of the year, when California's great crops are coming into harvest, the heavy grapes, the prunes, the apples and lettuce, and the rapidly maturing cotton, our highways swarm with the migrant workers, that shifting group of nomadic, poverty-stricken harvesters driven by hunger and the threat of hunger from crop to crop, from harvest to harvest, up and down the state and into Oregon to some extent, and into Washington a little. But it is California which has and needs the majority of these new gypsies. It is a short study of these wanderers that these articles will undertake. There are at least 150,000 homeless migrants wandering up and down the state, and that is an army large enough to make it important to every person in the state. To the casual traveler on the great highways, the movements of the migrants are mysterious, if they are seen at all, for suddenly the roads will be filled with open rattle-trap cars loaded with children and with dirty bedding, with fire-blackened cooking utensils. The boxcars and gondolas on the railroad lines will be filled with men, and then, just as suddenly, they will have disappeared from the main routes. On side roads and near rivers where there is little travel, the squalid, filthy squatters' camp will have been set up, and the orchards will be filled with pickers and cutters and dryers. The unique nature of California agriculture requires that these migrants exist and requires that they move about. Peaches and grapes, hops and cotton cannot be harvested by a resident population of laborers. For example, a large peach orchard, which requires the work of 20 men the year round, will need as many as 2,000 for the brief time of picking and packing. And if the migration of the 2,000 should not occur, if it should be delayed even a week, the crop will rot and be lost. Thus, in California, we find a curious attitude toward a group that makes our agriculture successful. The migrants are needed, and they are hated. Arriving in a district, they find the dislike always meted out by the resident to the foreigner, the outlander. This hatred of the stranger occurs in the whole range of human history, from the most primitive village form to our own highly organized industrial farming. The migrants are hated for the following reasons: that they are ignorant and dirty people, that they are carriers of disease, that they increase the necessity for police and the tax bill for schooling in a community, and that if they are allowed to organize, they can, simply by refusing to work, wipe out the season's crops. They are never received into a community, nor into the life of a community. Wanderers, in fact, they are never allowed to feel at home in the communities that demand their services. Let us see what kind of people they are, where they come from, and the roots of their wanderings. In the past, they have been of several races, encouraged to come and often imported as cheap labor: Chinese in the early period, then Filipinos, Japanese, and Mexicans. These were foreigners, and as such, they were ostracized and segregated and herded about. If they attempted to organize, they were deported or arrested, and having no advocates, they were never able to get a hearing for their problems. But in recent years, the foreign migrants have begun to organize, and at this danger signal, they have been deported in great numbers, for there was a new reservoir from which a great quantity of cheap labor could be obtained. The drought in the Middle West has driven the agricultural populations of Oklahoma, Nebraska, and parts of Kansas and Texas westward. Their lands are destroyed and they can never go back to them. Thousands of them are crossing the borders in ancient, rattling automobiles, destitute and hungry and homeless, ready to accept any pay so that they may eat and feed their children. And this is a new thing in migrant labor, for the foreign workers were usually imported without their children and everything that remains of their old life with them. They arrive in California, usually having used up every resource to get here, even to the selling of the poor blankets and utensils and tools on the way to buy gasoline. They arrive bewildered and beaten and usually in a state of semi-starvation, with only one necessity to face immediately, and that is to find work at any wage in order that the family may eat. And there is only one field in California that can receive them. Ineligible for relief, they must become migratory field workers. Because the old kind of laborers, Mexicans and Filipinos, are being deported and repatriated very rapidly, while on the other hand, the river of Dust Bowl refugees increases all the time, it is this new kind of migrant that we shall largely consider. The earlier foreign migrants have invariably been drawn from a peon class. This is not the case with the new migrants. They are small farmers who have lost their farms, or farm hands who have lived with the family in the old American way. They are men who have worked hard on their own farms and have felt the pride of possessing and living in close touch with the land. They are resourceful and intelligent Americans who have gone through the hell of the drought, have seen their lands wither and die and the topsoil blow away, and this to a man who has owned his land is a curious and terrible pain. And then they have made the crossing and have seen often the death of their children on the way. Their cars have broken down and been repaired with the ingenuity of the landman. Often they patch the worn-out tires every few miles. They have weathered the thing, and they can weather much more, for their blood is strong. They are descendants of men who crossed into the Middle West, who won their lands by fighting, who cultivated the prairies and stayed with them until they went back to desert. And because of their tradition and their training, they are not migrants by nature. They are gypsies by force of circumstances. In their heads, as they move wearily from harvest to harvest, there is one urge and one overwhelming need to acquire a little land again and to settle on it and stop their wandering. One has only to go into the squatters' camps where the families live on the ground and have no homes, no beds, and no equipment, and one has only to look at the strong, purposeful faces, often filled with pain, and more often, when they see the corporation-held idle lands, filled with anger, to know that this new race is here to stay and that heed must be taken of it. It should be understood that with this new race, the old methods of repression, of starvation wages, of jailing, beating, and intimidation are not going to work. These are American people. Consequently, we must meet them with understanding and attempt to work out the problem to their benefit as well as ours. It is difficult to believe what one large speculative farmer has said, that the success of California agriculture requires that we create and maintain a peon class. For if this is true, then California must depart from the semblance of democratic government that remains here. The names of the new migrants indicate that they are of English, German, and Scandinavian descent. These are Munns, Holbrooks, Hansens, Schmidts. And they are strangely anachronistic in one way. Having been brought up in the prairies where industrialization never penetrated, they have jumped with no transition from the old agrarian self-containing farm where nearly everything used was raised or manufactured, to a system of agriculture so industrialized that the man who plants a crop does not often see, let alone harvest, the fruit of his planting, where the migrant has no contact with the growth cycle. And there is another difference between their old life and the new. They have come from the little farm districts where democracy was not only possible, but inevitable, where popular government, whether practiced in the grange, in church organization, or in local government, was the responsibility of every man. And they have come into the country where, because of the movement necessary to make a living, they are not allowed any vote whatever, but are rather considered a properly unprivileged class. Let us see the fields that require the impact of their labor and the districts to which they must travel. As one little boy in a squatter's camp said, when they need us, they call us migrants. And when we've picked their crop, we're bums and we got to get out. There are the vegetable crops of the Imperial Valley, the lettuce, cauliflower, tomatoes, cabbage to be picked and packed, to be hoed and irrigated. There are several crops a year to be harvested, but there is no time distribution sufficient to give the migrants permanent work. The orange orchards deliver 2 crops a year, but the picking season is short. Farther north in Kern County and up the San Joaquin Valley, the migrants are needed for grapes, cotton, pears, melons, beans, and peaches. In the outer valleys near Salinas, Watsonville, and Santa Clara, there are lettuce, cauliflowers, artichokes, apples, prunes, apricots. North of San Francisco, the produce is of grapes, deciduous fruits, and hops. The Sacramento Valley needs masses of migrants for its asparagus, its walnuts, peaches, prunes, etc. These great valleys with their intensive farming make their seasonal demands on migrant labor. A short time, then, before the actual picking begins, there is the scurrying on the highways, the families in open cars hurrying to the ready crops and hurrying to be first at work. For it has been the habit of the growers' associations of the state to provide by importation twice as much labor as was necessary so that wages might remain low. Hence the hurry, for if the migrant is a little late, the places may all be filled and he will have taken his trip for nothing. And there are many things that may happen even if he is in time. The crop may be late, or there may occur one of those situations like at the Nipomo last year when 1,200 workers arrived to pick the pea crop only to find it spoiled by rain. All resources having been used to get to the field, the migrants could not move on. They stayed and starved until government aid tardily was found for them. And so they move, frantically, with starvation close behind them. And in this series of articles, we shall try to see how they live and what kind of people they are, what their living standard is, what is done for them and to them, and what their problems and needs are. For while California has been successful in its use of migrant labor, it is gradually building a human structure which will certainly change the state and may, if handled with the inhumanity and stupidity that have characterized the past, destroy the present system of agricultural economics.